Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm delighted to be hosting this evening's talk about this wonderful book, The Man Who Hated Women. We've got Amy Sohn, the author, and Susan Campbell, our dear friend, who is going to be in conversation with her this evening, and I'll introduce them both in just a moment. I just want to take a few moments to introduce you to some features of Crowdcast and share a few other items with you before we get started. I won't stay long. First of all, I see you've already discovered the chat. Thank you for letting us know where you're from. Please continue to chat away during the program. That's part of the fun of the virtual programs that we run. And we find that people make friends, and do know that this program is being recorded and can be viewed again on our website or just by following the same link that you used to register for tonight's program. And the chat remains live in perpetuity. So if you make a pen pal, you can come back and chat with them here. However, we are going to have a Q&A session toward the end of our program. If you have a question for Amy or Susan or both of them, rather than post it in the chat, if you could help us out by putting that down in the Ask a Question area that you see at the bottom of your screen, that will make it a lot easier for us to manage that part of the program. So please do help us out with that. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I want to just draw your attention to that long greenish bar that says your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. We've been really proud as an institution. We're a private nonprofit organization dependent on earned revenue, primarily through our guided house tour, which we weren't able to do for much of the past year. I'm really proud to say that we've been offering that house tour again, and people are coming in droves. But again, we've been without that major revenue source for much of the past year. So things are a little bit tight for the Mark Twain House and Museum, and we've been depending on the generosity of people like yourselves who've been attending our virtual programs since last April 2020 was when we offered our first one. So if you are able to share anything to help us out, I just want you to know on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny is put to very good use and very deeply appreciated. So thank you for helping if you can. So at the very top of the chat, and I will repost it in just a moment, is a link allowing you to order a signed copy of The Man Who Hated Women. Now we know you can purchase this book elsewhere, we're no dummies, but if you do purchase it through the Mark Twain House, you first of all get a signed copy, which you don't get everywhere, and you also have the satisfaction of knowing that your purchase benefits the museum. So please do take advantage of that opportunity if you're able. I want to thank tonight our sponsors. Like so many of our programs tonight is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public, WNPR. And the program is produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord. I'm very grateful to all of those people supporting us, so thank you. Susan Campbell is a dear friend, as I said, of the Mark Twain House and Museum. She does a lot of work with us. She's a distinguished lecturer at the University of New Haven's Department of Communication, Film, and Media Studies. She's also a columnist for Hearst Newspapers in Connecticut. She's an award-winning author of Dating Jesus, Fundamentalism, Feminism, and the American Girl, and the biography Tempest-Tossed, The Spirit of Isabella Beecher Hooker. Her latest book, Frog Hollow, Stories from an American Neighborhood, was published by Wesleyan University Press in March 2019. We're delighted to have her with us again tonight, talking with Amy Sohn, the New York Times bestselling author of several novels, including Prospect Park West, Motherland, and The Actress. A former columnist at New York Magazine, she's also written for Harper's Bazaar, Elle, The Nation, and the New York Times. She's been a writing fellow at Headland Center for the Arts, Writers OMI, and the studios at Mass MoCA. She's a native New Yorker and living in Brooklyn. And we're delighted to have them both here this evening. Give me a moment to bring them up on screen with me. Hi, Amy. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the Mark Twain House and to you, Jennifer, and to Susan for so generously putting this all together. Hey, Susan.
I'm delighted to have you both. So I'm going to sit back and just enjoy with everybody else, and Susan's going to be handling the Q&A. So everybody enjoy. Don't forget to ask questions. Don't forget to keep chatting away. And you two have a great time. I'll see you in a little bit.
Thank you. Amy, I am so excited to talk to you because I am so excited you wrote this book.
Thank you.
I teach a communication law class, and when we talk about community standards and individual freedoms, I had never heard of Anthony Comstock until I was researching for a lecture and thought, oh my God, he's Connecticut. For people who are not familiar with this Victorian, if you were introducing Anthony Comstock as a speaker, what would you say about him?
Blue-nosed. we could do word association. Fairfield County, New Canaan, Civil War veteran, monomaniac. I've been using this word monomaniac a lot because it was used against some of the women who I'm sure we'll be talking about in a few moments to say that they were obsessed with sex. Anthony Comstock was also obsessed with sex, obscenity, and contraception. And what other adjectives can I? Zealot, single-minded, not afraid to be hated. You know, he reminded me of some modern day political figures who court hatred. Just so, the true provocateur wants to engage with their enemies as opposed to run away from them. And one thing he was known for was when he was getting bad press, he would go to meetings of liberals who despised him and engage in debate with them. And they would try to shout him down, and then he would say, his version of why he thought what he did was right.
Was he, and we should say that Anthony Comstock was so committed to being anti-vice that I almost think he didn't have anything else in his life. I know he was married, I know he was a father, but his time in the Civil War, it seemed like he was more focused on bad language from other soldiers and his own inability to stop masturbating.
Yes, that's true. His Civil War diaries indicate constant battles with the devil, which one can only interpret, not even through a Freudian lens. There's no other interpret that he was really battling with the normal concerns of a 19, 20-year-old man. The most influential figure in his life was his mother, Polly Lockwood Comstock, who was a direct descendant of the first Puritans in New England, which is important. They lived near the Congregational Church in New Canaan, which happens to be near the New Canaan Historical Society, where I did a lot of research for this book. And yes, people have been asking me what radicalized him as I've been talking about this book. And I think there was an element of obsessive compulsive disorder because in the Civil War, he worked for the provost marshal and he had record keeping responsibilities. And he had very neat handwriting. So I think there was a kind of a need for order. Terrible speller, great handwriting. I don't know if this reminds you of anyone you know, but there's something about his meticulousness and his logging of his arrests and this logbook, which I think is now available online to anyone on I don't know how you say it, HathiTrust, contains the names of all the people he arrested, their educational level, what they were charged with, and really his accounts of his experience of their arrests. So yes, it's a fascinating, I feel like what's fascinating about him is, we needed this. The law was passed because of an individual and an individual wanting something at the right time in American history. And so one of the sad things for American women for 150 years is that this kind of weird monomaniacal zealot was able to make connections with the YMCA at a time when the YMCA was becoming increasingly concerned with obscenity. So had he not connected with these very influential, powerful blue blood men like Samuel Colgate and John Pierpont Morgan and Morris Jessup, he would not have had the institutional support to go to Washington and pass his law.
And such an influence, one guy, but such an influence on anti-abortion, on I keep saying vice, which to me, he was against everything that makes life fun. Take away abortion. He was against
take away abortion, yeah.
Everything that people actually enjoy doing, he wanted to shut that down and live this. And he was, I have to ask you before I start in asking questions about all these incredible women that he hounded, some to their grave. Where did you first hear about him, and when did you say, oh, here's a book?
I think I had heard about the Comstock laws and law in the context of abortion rights, probably when I was in college. There was a major pro-choice rally in 1992 when I was in college. So I think I didn't understand what he did, but I associated the word Comstock with anti-choice. And the way that I became turned on to his story was really, I discovered the story of Ida Craddock first. I became really interested in women and insanity. And I was looking for a book to write that dealt with women and insanity. I found this incredible story of Ida Craddock, which we could talk about maybe a little bit later. And I read that she was prosecuted under various state Comstock laws. And then I wondered, who was this man that she seemed to have such a personal relationship with? The wonderful thing for a narrative nonfiction writer about Anthony Comstock is he actually interacted with many of the people he went after. It was not abstract or from a distance. He was located in Lower Manhattan, where I happen to be speaking to you right now from my partner's apartment. And he was doing his business on Nassau Street, and there was a lot going, many of the women I write about were located in New York, and he met them, arrested them himself, went into their homes. And this is like the richest thing for a nonfiction writer, is you're always looking for face-to-face interactions. You want those novelistic details of human interaction. So he was, the best way to describe him is he was larger than life. He was so closely associated with this law that has a very long, banal name related to obscenity, that it was known as the Comstock law, not only in our lifetimes, but 150 years ago. How many people go to Washington and get a law passed, and then it becomes colloquially named after them?
If you started out interested more in Ida Craddock, at what point did this book start to form around the women that he pursued?
So all of us, who are, and I know you can relate to us, where you're in that book hunting phase, and you're obsessively Googling and gathering and saying, what are the resources out there? What's the source material, and what's the story I want to tell? I realized that, for one, a book had already been written about Ida Craddock, which is a wonderful book called Heaven's Bride, and that it was just a little bit too narrow. The showdown between one incredibly interesting woman and Comstock was not quite enough. So then I began to think, how many women did he go after? Who were they? And why did he go after them? And my book focuses on women who were intellectually serious about promoting women's equality, both in the bedroom and in life. But I also tell the story of Madame Restell, who was the most notorious abortionist in New York. I realized pretty early on I wanted it to be about intellectual women, and I wanted it to be about writers. Comstock prosecuted far more men than women because of the nature of the obscenity trade, and the people who were publishing obscene books tended to be men. But there was this fascinating group of free lovers, free thinkers, women who really inspired me and made me understand that though we think of the Victorian era as this prudish period with buttoned up women and sex hating and repressive, the truth of the matter was there was this really rich flowering of intellectual liberty, and we can't call it liberty, intellectual radicalism between around the 1840s leading up to the founding of the ACLU in 1920. And this was a chapter in civil liberties history that no one had really written about. And I think the thing I'm most proud of in this book is that I make the case that the sex radicals, as I call them, laid the groundwork for the free speech movement of the 20th century. Women are seldom credited as important figures in the history of free speech, because this period is not well researched or well written about. And the truth of the matter is, we would not have an ACLU were it not for these kind of quirky, weird, eccentric, crazy women.
That's interesting. You would say that. You mentioned free lovers. There were what Comstock saw as pornography could be, at times it appeared, it was simply discussions about the human body and the sexual act. Like, these women would talk about that freely in fairly medical terms, but that to Comstock was a bridge too far. Was there any element about these women? They seem to be pretty disparate, from abortionists to free lovers to, I mean, not that they didn't cross-pollinate a little bit, but it was a pretty wide group of women that he went after. And it seemed like the only thing they shared was they talked about the body. They had something to do with the body. Maybe not even the sex act.
They didn't all even agree about contraception and abortion. So, for example, the free love movement was really ultimately, we like to think of it, for those of us who know about Oneida, we think free lovers in the 1800s were all about multiple partners. The truth of the matter is, most free lovers were monogamous, or what was then called exclusivists, which I love. Because, in these modern day discussions of polyamory, I like the word exclusivist. It's a little tonier than monogamous. Monogamous sounds so boring.
Yeah.
But they really ultimately believed in easier divorce laws, civil marriage, which was a totally transgressive idea at the time, except for the Quakers, the idea that people could enter into marriage contracts as individuals. They believed in fair division of domestic labor. I hope this is resonating with some of our people here today, since this is something that's argued about and a major problem in modern couples today. And they were really just romantic egalitarians, is the way I like to think of them. So free lovers, one might think, were very pro-contraception and perhaps supportive of women's right to abortion. In fact, they were generally opposed to what they would have called artificial contraception, because they believed it got in the way of the right thinking and just minds of true free lovers. And to be more specific, they practiced a technique that was called male continence, which was essentially the channeling of the male orgasm out. Are we allowed to say anything? This is Connecticut.
It's all grown up, so.
This was not withdrawal. It was it was channeling. It was orgasm without ejaculation. And so this was a technique that was practiced in many free love communes, such as Oneida. And what's so fascinating to me is there's so many contradictions within this radical world. One would think that the free lovers were the first to use the multiple methods of physical contraception that were available, where they weren't. Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tennessee Claflin were actually anti-abortion. And I don't know how much, recent internet Googling you've done, but they've actually been kind of co-opted by the anti-choice movement because they had written, various things over the course of their lifetimes saying that abortion was wrong. So what I love about the women that I write about is many of them would have hated each other and seen for example, Angela Haywood, this free lover in Worcester County, Massachusetts, had she been in a room alone with Madame Restell, the most notorious abortionist in New York, I think she would have shouted her down and said that what she was doing was wrong. But the free lovers did believe ultimately that men should not control women's bodies. And interestingly, much of the foundation of the free love movement was in abolitionism. And some of the arguments that they made in favor of women's liberty were based on anti-slavery arguments. That women should not be enslaved to men. And that, for example, if a woman married a man for money, that was a form of servitude, and it was wrong because it stood in the way of her marrying for what she should marry for, which was love and mutual respect. And I have to say, as a woman, like coming of age in my 20s in New York and having various friends that dated wealthy men, this is still a constant thing. You know, the expression, marry for money, you earn every cent.
We didn't talk about that in my neighborhood, but okay. You, I think I know the answer, but you explore so many of these women, like Victoria Woodhull and her sister. Why? It appears that history can dismiss these women for one supposed misstep. And by misstep, I mean something that takes them out of acceptable thought. Victoria Woodhull had a fascinating life. If you've read anybody in the audience, if you haven't read about her, you're missing out. She's fascinating. But history pretty much dismisses her or doesn't talk about her at all. The same with a lot of these other women. They may have a book or two. Why do they get dropped off the page so easily?
Well, there was a wonderful article in the New Yorker this week about my book, and and by Margaret Talbot, who's one of my favorite New Yorker writers. And she quoted a passage from my book where I say they were left out of sex history because they were not doctors.
Mm-hmm.
They were left out of women's history because they were too sexual, and they were left out of progressive history because they were women. And she then points out that they were left out of all these histories because they were really frickin' weird. Which is wonderful. Yeah. I mean, Victoria Woodhull, Tennessee Claflin, Margaret Sanger had been well covered, but I felt it was important to tell their stories in the context of the Comstock laws. But the women that I get really excited about talking about, you know, when I'm talking about this book are the ones that are not well known. So I think it was a combination, you know, and I think the same thing is true today. Progressive circles are often very rational. And we like to think of progressivism as being very open to controversial ideas around sexuality. Well, the truth of the matter is that's not always the case. And when these women were coming up in the progressive movement, these movements were dominated by men. And so they were writing really provocative, complicated things about women's pleasure beyond just women's right to control reproduction. And I think that in some cases, they were these pariahs, you know, and it's interesting because in some ways progressivism is more sex positive now, but I think it's a writing, and I've experienced this myself, having, you know, written many novels and done all kinds of things and used sexuality as an opportunity to write about other things. You're still very stigmatized when you write about, talk about, and think about sex. You're stigmatized as déclassé, and you're stigmatized as unintelligent, and you are stigmatized as not contributing to the intellectual debate. Well, when in truth, what these women were talking about was absolute life and death issues about women's bodies, autonomy, and liberty.
That's an excellent point. This book was a bit of a departure for you, nonfiction, correct?
Yeah. I mistakenly thought that if I wrote narrative nonfiction, it would be easier than novels because I wouldn't have to figure out how it ended. In fact, I learned that we toil away for years and years and years in archives and libraries and historical societies for a couple of gets. And it's just an extraordinary amount of work, but I loved every minute of it because I learned about this chapter of American history. I think that's sort of what you were saying about Victoria Woodhull. I mean, this was not something I learned about in women's history classes. I think a lot of us were maybe tangentially aware of Victoria Woodhull. We had this idea that she ran for president in 1872, but don't know much beyond that. And so for me, it was just so wonderful. You know, this is a chapter of radical history that I'd never read about before.
You mentioned this just briefly earlier. Do we have a modern day Anthony Comstock?
Mm-hmm.
We have. No, I won't answer my own question. I don't know the answer.
You know, he had a bit of a renaissance in the 80s and 90s and was compared to Jesse Helms, who I guess is considered kind of a dated figure now. But I do think for example, Greg Abbott in Texas and in the Missouri legislature, they're, deliberately conflating abortion and contraception. We have so many Republican-run state legislatures with men trying to take away access to women's contraception, even putting the abortion issue aside to make it more difficult, since the Hobby Lobby case, for women to get money to pay for contraception. And, one of the things that's fascinating to me about this issue is these same stigmatizations that, for example, women that use contraception are promiscuous and should be judged for it and shouldn't have access for it, which are, this access to it, which are still being kind of bandied about today, totally ignore the fact that many women need access to contraception for reasons having absolutely nothing to do with preventing pregnancy. Other women's health issues become not taken seriously, and women's health is not considered of national importance, and it's something that just makes my ears turn red, because I really believe that ultimately our bodies and our lives are seen as more disposable.
So he is like the patron saint. He may not live, there may not be another Anthony Comstock, but he's like floating above the Missouri.
Yeah, let's just call it out. Brett Kavanaugh.
Okay.
Let's even call Amy Barrett a modern Anthony Comstock.
Yeah. I'm going to save that question. He hounded people, and I read, and I don't know if this is the case, he actually exulted and kept track of the people he felt he'd driven to suicide. That's a monomania. I'm having a hard time getting my mind around.
That's almost, dare I say, a form of sadism and real sickness. Some of this was rumors that were repeated by free lovers. But when he was asked about suicides, he would take it on and say, yes, these many people have taken their own lives. And that's because the attitude that he had about the people he was going after was so contemptuous.
Yeah.
And if we want to take a second to try to understand where he was coming from in the context of his life and times, he believed that weak moral character was inherited, which is very complicated. This was the time when people believed that, for example, criminality, poverty, and alcoholism were inherited. It's interesting because we now know alcoholism may, in fact, be inherited. But the idea was that someone who sold dirty books was not ever doing it for the money to make a living. They were doing it because they were inwardly corrupt. And so to the extent, and the reason he reviled these people, who in many cases, from a class perspective, were trying to make a living in New York at a time of incredible, there's so many parallels to today, incredible wealth polarization. We call it the Gilded Age. New York was the locus of incredible wealth and poverty at the same time. Depended where you went. And so the idea was that smutty booksellers were not just trying to make a living, but were putting books in the hands of vulnerable children. He was often very focused on the idea that that these books were getting into the hands of the vulnerable. And it's important to say that, even though I call my book The Man Who Hated Women, his opinion about women was paternalistic and patronizing, but really the norm for the time, which was women were not seen as individual agents or possessing agency. They were to follow their husband, their children, and God. You had that was it.
And might that have fueled his fervor when these women, these independent women operating as sole proprietors, sometimes married or not, and here they're bucking all of that. They're not keeping
exactly. He was personally repelled, for example, by the Claflin sisters, Victoria Woodhull and Tennessee Claflin, because they moved to New York. They started a brokerage house.
How dare they?
They started a leftist newspaper. They, at the time, Delmonico's, you know, a couple of the Delmonicos are very close to where I am right now. You weren't allowed to eat there if you were a woman unaccompanied by a man. So there's this famous story where Tennessee Claflin was told by Charlie Delmonico, you need to have a male escort. She went out and got a cabbie sitting on his box, brought him in and said, bring tomato soup for 3. her sister and the cabbie. So that's what's so wonderful about, you know, as a feminist reading about this period, it's so inspiring to read about women who were, number one, taking on really challenging long-held beliefs about women, family, marriage, sex, and romance. And at the same time, women who were not politically enfranchised. You know, they couldn't, all writers are attracted to writers' stories. And I think that one of the reasons I love these women is they were getting their ideas out there through writing and speaking, which sadly, you know, some of that has been lost. We don't have kind of a public speaking tradition in the radical world on the level that it was. Victoria Woodhull, we know, you know, spoke to tens of thousands of people at a time. Emma Goldman did the same thing. You know, she could move 50,000 people to tears in one speech.
Mesmerizing. This is going to sound like a Barbara Walters question, so I apologize in advance.
Wait, am I supposed to like cry?
No,
Okay.
That's Oprah. Barbara is, if you were a tree.
No, but
if you want to cry, then go ahead, but this is not a sad one. Is there anything to like about Anthony Comstock?
You know what? It's been interesting, you know, reading some other reviews of my book where some people have said I'm too hard on him and that kind of thing. I actually have a certain affection for him. And what I mean by that is that because of the time that I spent reading everything he wrote and going to the town in which he was raised, I believe very firmly that he was a product of his time. And so to interpret him as somehow out of step with the mores of his time is to kind of impose, you know, all of the things that we know now. If you're studying American history, you have to understand that the foundation of this country was religion, for better and for worse, and that people who were raised in New England in the 1840s had a sphere of life that was controlled by small communities, total lack of privacy, and the whole organizing structure of their life was family and God. And that's not necessarily the worst thing. You know, now we kind of have patchwork morality. It is helpful when you can say, these are the right things to do, and here's why. I'll show you this, this, and this. So it's not so much that I have sympathy for him, but I understand he was such an iconic portrait of his time in that he was 19 when the Civil War, at the beginning of the Civil War. His brother died at Gettysburg. He bounced around a couple of dry good houses in Winnepock and Norwalk before saying, if I really want to make it big, I'm going to move to New York. He moved to New York at a time that it was pulsing with sex for sale, pornography, smut, everything. And who wouldn't be shocked? Who wouldn't be shocked with a background like that?
I think the affection you feel, I think you probably have to like someone a little bit if you're going to write a book about them, or otherwise, good luck. I think your affection for him showed. And I also think what your book does really well is you take these women and they're icons, but you treat them as people. Like we see their fear. We see them worried about losing their income because of Anthony Comstock's, you know, monomaniacal pursuit of them. And I came away fascinated with them and wanting to know more about each one of them. Even if I thought I knew quite a bit about a couple of them, I came away thinking you fleshed them out really well.
Thank you. I tried to, and I'm in love to varying degrees with all of the women in my book.
Do you have a favorite?
Ida Craddock.
Well, you started with her. I can see where you keep up with it. The only other thing I want to ask, and then we'll open it up to questions. And if you have a question, again, please put it down and ask a question, and we'll try and get to them. Is there a lesson we can learn from a life like Anthony Comstock's, or should we be learning the lesson from the women he hounded?
I'd rather look at the lives of the women. And the first thing I always say is direct action works. Manipulating the media is a game that was played by Anthony Comstock, but was also played to really positive effect by these radical women. They had social networks of support in the progressive world where they would do things like deliver a petition thousands of feet long, trying to get the Comstock laws overturned. Women's narratives and women's stories are powerful. The personal is political. And we're at a really, really treacherous moment in terms of voting rights in this country. But it's interesting, having spent 5 years researching these women's lives and understanding the complicated and twisted path to voting rights in our history, to think that all of these women could not vote, and they were tried by all male judges and juries. And yet they never gave up. They never stopped fighting. They never stopped publishing. They never stopped speaking. And they used writing and speech to try to affect change. And, the sad thing about their stories is in many cases it was after their lifetimes. But what's so powerful to me is that I don't even think they were aware of their power. But the sex conversation around the Comstock laws, it was called anti-Comstockism of the 1870s, 80s, 90s, then created a broader world that was less focused specifically on overturning the Comstock laws, but on speech. And so it's a good thing and a bad thing. The bad thing is that the sex radicals paved the way and weren't really credited. The good thing is being against the Comstock laws became kind of an excuse to have a broader and more popular conversation about speech, because many advocates of free speech did not like these women's writing. They were disgusted by. There are many people that were pro speech and free speech who thought that some of these marriage guides and marriage manuals were vulgar.
But would they still have supported their publication?
Some did and some didn't. Sometimes, I think so many of us as women doing bold and provocative things, we have complicated relationships with male mentors. And in many cases, these women had male mentors that were kind of slapping them on the hand and encouraging them at the same time. Put away this sex writing, but ultimately your cause is just. Or, if only you'd stop being obsessed with sex, you might have some really provocative and interesting things to say. So the praise was sort of tempered and complicated. Anyway, I'd love to hear your questions.
Sure. This is a question from Mary. Can you talk about the contradiction between the misogynistic approach between, on the one hand, Puritan, and on the other hand, the fascination and obsession with sex and vice? I believe Mary's referring to Anthony Comstock.
Yeah, they're two sides of the same coin. So maybe just to fill in a little bit more of his personal history, since he's a New Canaan native. He went to the Civil War at a time, this is when I was saying before, he was like this perfect product of his time. That, to me, feels like the first time he was really exposed to smut, because what had happened was mailing and paper printing but got cheaper and easier. And so if you were a 19-year-old in the Civil War, your fellow soldiers were consuming a lot of smut. And that, I think, must have been a very arresting experience for him to see that. He also must have been kind of turned on by it because, I mean, we know he constantly wanted to masturbate. We don't know if it was because of particular reading material or not, but I'm sure it was hard to turn his eye. And so he went to the Civil War. He had had a bad experience with wine as a 10 or 12-year-old. And in the Civil War, he would dump out his whiskey ration so nobody else could drink it. He made a lot of enemies. And one day he came to his bunk to find a trash fire set on his bed. And he wrote in his diary that he was kind of emboldened by their hatred of him. So again, it's those two poles, you know, where he must have felt bad that nobody liked him. But at some point, he made this choice to say, I'll never be like you. And to kind of lean into that. Now, psychologically, people have tried to ask, you know, what was going on with his sexuality. And it's tough. It's tough to be an armchair, you know, psychologist with this. But I do think that what he had in common with all of the women that I write about is just total obsession with the meaning of sex and the power of sex. He understood in the same way that the women did that sex was meaningful and that women's pleasure was powerful and terrifying.
Thank you. This is a question from Donald. Why is the book entitled The Man Who Hated Women? Did Comstock really hate women as a gender? Did they hate him?
That's a provocative question at the end. I've been careful to say in my book that he did not believe he was a man who hated women. He hated a particular kind of women. And those ranged from wives of smut sellers to these free love intellectuals that I talk about. Women who were trying to upend the status quo, particularly marriage and divorce laws and division of domestic chores, were totally challenging this Victorian ideal of womanhood that was incredibly powerful for religious reasons. And so the short answer is no, he didn't think so. Did the women hate him? You know, the women were so optimistic about sex and relationships. There were many times reading these women's ideas when I thought, oh my God, you're too romantic. You know, even the best marriages can't solve everybody's problems. They had such enormous faith in the ability of right thinking and intellectual men and women to like make each other happy, that I actually think they really loved men and they had very high hopes for men.
Very high hopes. That's a good one. Thank you. This is from Rafia. Thank you for your work. One of the women in the book, Victoria Woodhull, was also a known eugenicist with racist tendencies. In at least one speech, she said women should embrace white purity. Is it really worth heroicizing her? Where are the Black women in your book?
I don't know that particular quote by Victoria Woodhull. I talk about in the book about something called feminist hereditarianism. And this is so tricky because getting into eugenics, you know, depending on when you're talking about it, that is very, very complicated because the meaning of kind of controlled reproduction changed an extraordinary amount from the 1870s, which is the period that I focus on with Victoria Woodhull, to what many may think of as sort of Nazi era eugenics. Feminist hereditarianism was essentially the idea that women should marry better and marry for love and not be raped by their husbands and not have children with brutish men who included alcoholics and domestic abusers. So I think it's important. I wouldn't call her a eugenicist. I would call her a feminist hereditarian, and I'm happy to get into this more at a later time. We also know that her sister, that Victoria was nominated for president on a ticket with Frederick Douglass, although he was never consulted, and I think in many ways he was kind of used as a political symbol. But there's a great book about Victorian Tennessee that deals a lot with race by a woman named Amanda Frisken, Frisken. So if you're curious about that, I would read her book, and I quote a little bit of it in my book.
This question is from Steve. You've referred to Ida Craddock, but tell us a little more about her.
Oh gosh, wait, Susan, what should I do? Like the 60-second version?
You can go a little longer than that.
Okay. So Ida Craddock was born in 1857 in Philadelphia. Her father was a cannabis salesman. Her mother was a French-born woman who raised her Unitarian. She went to Friend Central, very well-regarded Quaker school in Philadelphia, and was a star student. She learned to read at 3 years old. And she wanted to be the first female undergraduate at the University of Pennsylvania, but was refused 3 times because she was a woman. She, at the time, being in her 20s, at a time of rich sexual writing, including Croft Ebbing, a woman named Alice Stockham, who was an Evanston gynecologist, and others, became really obsessed with sex and started becoming intrigued by an area of research known as phallic worship or sex worship, which was essentially world religion meets sexual symbolism. And in 1892, when she was in her, what would that be, late 20s, she bought a Ouija board and channeled the ghost of a man she had known as a teenager, who became her friend, and then her husband, and then her lover, in that order.
Best part ever.
And then when she went to the World's Fair in 1893 and saw the belly dancers moving their hips, she was reminded of her wonderful sex life with her ghost, whose name was Soph. And the long and short of it is, for around 9 years following the World's Fair, she published these marriage guides for young couples, counseling really sound marital and sexual advice, and was run down by postal inspectors in several cities before she finally went head to head with Anthony Comstock in New York in 1901 and 1902. And my mother's from Philadelphia. I dedicate the book to my grandmother, who went to normal school. Ida Craddock wanted a 4-year education. She did not want to be a teacher. And the norm for women of her generation was the highest hope a bright woman could have was to teach. And she was totally thwarted by Penn not letting her in. And so she's just is so inspiring to me on so many levels. I think because wouldn't you say, Susan, she's the weirdest?
But the most interesting, yes.
Yeah.
Of all the women in your book.
Well, because everyone asked me, did she really have sex with a ghost? And I say, well, when you've read 900 pages of her diary of her ghost sex, this was not a marketing ploy. She billed herself as Mrs. Ida C. Craddock because she understood, for 2 reasons. She was married, though not to someone living. And the second reason, she understood that you could not market sexual knowledge as an unmarried woman. It was too scandalous. And she would have been very pleased that after she died, which you'll have to read the book to get the details, that about half the obituaries referred to her as Mrs. and the other half as Miss.
But I could totally understand how she would catch your eye and you would want to research her. And I had that same question. Did she really have sex with a ghost? Because awesome. But
well, that's why spiritualism, I mean, it's another thing that, like, you know, living in our modern times, it's hard to understand, but many, many Americans communed with ghosts in all sorts of ways. Yeah. And they had a total ability to distinguish the living world from what Ida Craddock called the borderland. Yeah. I don't believe she was schizophrenic.
That's such a quick and easy way to dismiss a woman.
Yeah, to say she's schizophrenic if she had a relationship with a ghost.
Sure, I'd rather think she did.
There's a book by Anne Braude. I believe it's called Radical Spirits. Did you read that when you were researching? Yeah, and it's sort of about the connections between radicalism and spiritualism, which I find, one of the fascinating things about researching this book is a lot of the source material that I drew upon on the internet was from occult publications. Occult and spiritualist publications were also very radical. And so if you're looking to research American radical history of the 19th century, one of the best places you can look is places like water cure journals, health journals, and occult periodicals. So that could be, that's what Anne Brauda writes about in her book, is this people who had unconventional religious beliefs often had unconventional beliefs about other things as well, such as women's role in marriage and family.
And spiritualism was so egalitarian. You didn't have to be a man to be a medium. You didn't have to.
Yeah, and
that's seance, not sex. I really have to read more, I guess.
Yeah, and that's fascinating too, to understand spiritualism. I think, many of us, if we know one thing about spiritualism, we know that there were these girls up in Hydesville that heard this knocking. But what's really fascinating about it is it was a very female, it was a woman-led religion.
Very much, very popular. There's a question from Sam, who's also a writer. She wants to know if I'm assuming that's right, Sam. She wants to know if in your research you came across anything that surprised you.
That surprised me. Well, I have a piece out this week that's about the fact that Comstock's mother died of childbirth-related hemorrhage. So that was something that I'd never read about in any other book. And she appears to have died. There's conflicting accounts as to whether she had 8 children or 10, but she died following either her 8th or 10th childbirth of hemorrhage. Mm-hmm. And Comstock was 10 years old. This is 1854. And he came home from school to find his mother dead. And this is what, people like you and me kind of scratch our heads about, is could this have had a different impact on him, where he saw the childbirth as causing her death? Instead, he doubled down at this, at this vulnerable age. The way he processed this trauma was to say that his mother had died in the act of being fruitful and multiplying, and that she had committed the ultimate sacrifice of the Victorian era woman. Again, women's lives were considered expendable in the service of family and God.
By Anthony Comstock as well.
And many other Americans, yeah.
I have to say, Jacques Lamar put in the chat that he wants to thank you for being the first author to discuss ghost sex as part of a Mark Twain House and Museum event. Kudos.
Wait, I also want to go back to one earlier question about the Black women in the book. I did try to find sex radicals of the period who were African American. And there's some interesting writing about Black women's history related to the history of sex in later periods, such as the Kinsey era. And I can get you more information about that. My friend Wednesday Martin wrote a book that credits 2 1950s era women with incredible advances about sex. Unfortunately, I think that the radical publications that I talk about, although the abolitionist movement was more multiracial, the radical publications that I'm talking about, many of them based in the Midwest and New England, were white dominated. I really wanted, out of the 8 women that I wrote about, to have diversity. And I just, for this time period, I couldn't find one person.
Really early, the suffrage movement was predominantly white. That was one of the complaints.
Yeah, and also it's one of the reasons I'm glad, ultimately I wasn't that interested in suffrage history. These women, most of the women in my book thought that suffrage was too constricted. They were too radical for suffrage. And as you know from writing about Isabella Beecher Hooker, many suffragists were what we would now consider to be conservative women. Just because that we like to think, they were suffragists, they were progressive on every issue. No, certainly not so about race, and in terms of sexuality and contraception, not so. And so I'm writing about the outcasts and the rebels.
we have time for one more question, so I'm going to twist one from Mary a little bit. If you had to choose, this is a totally unfair question, I acknowledge it at the outset. Did Anthony Comstock's mother influence him more than religion? Did witnessing the death or witnessing the lifeless form of his mother push him toward his own radicalism?
I think the two are entwined because, and I should have said this earlier, I mean, his mother read Bible stories to all of the Comstock children. She was not just the model of the Victorian era woman, but she was the teacher of religion in that family. And so his whole love of religion, Bible stories, the time that he spent at Sunday school, she was the real architect of that and the moral center. And probably the most generous thing we could say to Anthony Comstock is that he had a strong woman in his life, strong moral core and moral fiber. And sadly, he twisted and he took it too far. And instead of, rationally thinking about the fact that she had died in childbirth, I think maybe we could say that what he was trying to do, I haven't thought about it until this talk, Susan, but this is like I feel this is my doorknob moment. He was trying to reincarnate his mother in the form of other American women. In other words, to make more American women in her mold. And he believed that the way to do that was to keep them away from vice, keep them away from prostitution. He was not the kind of guy who would say, why are women turning to sex work? What are the economic reasons for it? He would say, why was there a lack of moral guidance in their life? So sadly, in trying to recreate and reincarnate his dead mother for his 70-year, life and 4 or 5 decade vice hunting career, he caused many more deaths. But we have to end. We have to end positively. These radical women are freaking awesome. So I hope you learn about them from me and from the other work out there, because they are inspiring. I mean, Susan, you tell me, they're inspiring.
They are inspiring. I enjoyed this book, not just because I was interested in Anthony Comstock, but as I said earlier, learning what I learned about some of these women. I'd never heard of Ida Craddock, and now I must know more. They are inspiring. It is an inspiring book.
Thank you so much, and this is delightful. I think Mark Twain would have been happy.
Mark Twain would have been delighted, and I have to say, what a fascinating conversation. Thank you both for being with us this evening, and Susan, thank you for your thoughtful questions, and Amy, thank you for all you've brought to the table here. It's been fascinating, and I want to thank our audience too. We get comments all the time from people who come and speak in person or virtually that our audience has asked the best questions, and I have to say tonight's been a really good example of that, so thank you to them. Thank you to Jacques for being here tonight and for helping pull this program together. If you did not feel inclined to purchase this book before this talk, I cannot imagine that you're feeling disinclined now. Please click the link. Jacques just reposted it. And remember, you get a signed copy, and it benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So, Amy, have you been to the Mark Twain House?
I'm coming this summer.
All right, then. We can't wait to see you, and we'll bring Susan in, and we'll take a nice tour together. And maybe we'll do this, like you said, Amy, when your paperback comes out. We'll do this again.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Have a great evening, everybody, and thanks for your donations and all your other support. We'll see you next time.